module or something in Arctic ecology. So it fit right into the curriculum. And the teachers were really interested to have me come in. But without exception, every single one of the teachers that I spoke to thought that there was either only a few hundred to maybe a few thousand polar bears left.
Wow.
That's how out of touch they were with reality. And they were utterly shocked to hear that there was at least 26,000.
Huh.
And that, 26,000 is the official number, given by the IUCN. But it was after that year of giving talks to middle school classes that they refused to let me continue giving lectures.
Huh. So it's sad, because you would want to reassure children to not worry about things that are not a problem, certainly way out of their control. Yet, in fact, the environmental movement tries to worry children about the future, and it strikes me that's pretty unhealthy.
Well, indeed, and it's not just children; it's adults as well. But really, what they're trying to do is elicit an emotional response. And they don't want people to think. They want people to feel. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem. And so when I come in, I try and encourage people to think about whether it's logical, for example, that this would follow this and follow this.
Right.
But because the whole public perception of climate change is so tied up with potential polar bear extinction and has been for over a decade, that it's one of the reasons why they need to shut me up.
Yeah.
Is that if I can show people that, in fact, polar bears are not threatened with extinction, that they are dealing with declining sea ice very ably, then it's likely that they are going to reject some of the other fear-enhanced rhetoric that's going to come about climate change.
Right. And it's interesting. I find that in the climate debate, virtually every single aspect, whether it's temperature or extreme weather or ocean acidification or sea level rise, they're either wrong or they're, hopelessly exaggerating. So now we can add polar bears to the list of things in which they're completely wrong. But anyway, what is the best way for us to help protect polar bears if indeed they need protection at all?
Well, really, the protections that need to be done have already been made. There is an international treaty that was signed in 1973 that will protect bears from overhunting. That has been the most critical piece of legislation agreement in the international arena that has allowed polar bears to come back from the really horrendous overhunting that went on in the previous 100 years.
Okay.
And all of that's still in place. And so polar bears are hunted in Canada, but they are managed, so there are limits.
So this is an environmental success story then, that we're actually...
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely an environmental success story. And, what we're learning is that the bears can actually thrive with less ice than experts thought they could. And that's what we're learning.
Yeah, if we go back, let's say, to the medieval warm period or the Holocene maximum or things like that, there probably was less ice up there, and that was well within the period that polar bears existed. I mean, Bob Carter, who passed away recently, unfortunately, a climate expert from Australia, he used to show pictures of polar bears and said, well, this must be virtual reality, because they would otherwise have gone, during the medieval warm period or many other times. Surely there was much less ice at times since they evolved in the Arctic in the past.
Oh, we absolutely know that that's true. And the difficult part is knowing for sure how they managed with that. And the only real evidence that we have comes from some population genetic studies. And one of the interesting things that has come out of those studies is that it looks like that the bear numbers did not decline, say, during the last warm period, which was about 125,000 years ago, but the numbers did decline after the last ice age.
Wow.
Now, that was, or during the last ice age. So it was either, what the genetics is either picking up the fact that too much, that, expansion of ice that happened during the last ice age, which was one of the most severe ice ages that there's been, for a couple of million years, that it so reduced polar bear habitat and seal habitat that their numbers were reduced, or that genetics is picking up on the really severe decline in polar bear numbers that came during the whaling period.
Yeah. So let me just get some numbers here straight. Just remembering from last week, the polar bear evolved how many years ago, roughly?
My best guess is between 400,000 and 160,000.
Right. So the time period
based on all of the evidence.
Yeah. So the previous interglacial, they were well established, and they did okay. They did fine.
Yeah. And there was another interglacial. If they evolved 40,000 years ago, there would have been another interglacial as well. So that would have been two interglacials they would have survived. We know they survived. We don't know whether the numbers went up or down. That's
right.
What we don't know.
Right. Now, what do the native people in the north, I mean, they actually live right there. What do they say about polar bears? Do they think they're endangered?
Mostly they don't. In fact, and in fact, in November 2019, number of Inuit groups got together and submitted an affidavit saying that they've not noticed a decline in health of polar bears, and that population sizes have actually increased since the 1980s.
Huh. Wow.
And really, and the other thing is that, from a number of communities around the Canadian Arctic, is that they're having problems with polar bears entering their communities.
Yeah.
And in a way that they weren't having in the 80s. So It wasn't a problem then, and it is a problem now. And polar bear experts blame it on lack of sea ice. But in fact, an increased population size is another quite plausible and reasonable explanation.
Yeah. You're the last chapter in your book, and the book again is The Polar Bear Catastrophe That Didn't Happen. Did I get the title right? Let's see.
That never happened.
That never happened, right. As I say,
the polar bear catastrophe that never happened.
Right, and we'll be putting a link to that right under the podcast. You have a chapter at the end called Why I Do What I Do. So why do you do what you do? I mean, it causes a lot of stress, I imagine.
Well, exactly. But what I do is follow the science. And as I mentioned previously, I mean, I've learned what I know about polar bears from reading the published literature. What experts like Canadian polar bear expert Ian Sterling, what he's written. He's been writing things about polar bears since the 1970s. So I've gone back through that literature, and that's where I see where what they said in the 70s or 80s about polar bear behavior, about the relationship with ice and seals, is different from what they're writing and telling the media now. And so all I'm really trying to do is to point out that this is an inconsistency.
Right.
You were saying this then, and now you're saying something else, and let's get to, let's resolve this. And I'm not making things up. I am taking my commentary from where the science leads me.
Right.
And, nobody pays me to say these things. These are my own scientific opinions, and that happens in all kinds of science.
Right.
Right. Like there are scientific facts, but then you have to interpret the facts. And so what we're talking about is a difference of interpretation of facts, and that happens all the time in science. It's not unique to polar bears or anything else. The difficulty for polar bear science is that no one has ever challenged these particular biologists before.
I'll bet.
And they don't like it one bit.
No, and yet you're using their own research and their own papers to show what's really happening. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I understand, just to sort of shift gears here for a second, because we're going to end it in just a few minutes, that you've also written some fiction books. Is that the case?
Yes, I've written two science-based fiction books. One is called Eaten, and it's set in Newfoundland in the year 2025. And the other one is called Upheaval, that was just published in December.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's set on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia.
Oh, cool. I'll have to tell the Science Fiction Association of Ottawa, because, it's nice to see Canadian science fiction.
Yeah, and the first book really talks about what I was imagining, what might happen if polar bears in spring didn't get enough to eat.
Uh-huh.
And would they present a danger to people on shore? And it looked to me like the area where, if that happened, that the place most in danger would be Newfoundland.
Wow.
And then my most recent book is looking at what would happen if a tsunami hit an area that had thick ice covering it.
Huh. I'll bet that would be a disaster.
Most scientists have not really looked very closely at what would happen there. But there's also polar bears in that book, too. Yeah,
and I guess eaten is probably when they don't have enough to eat, they're looking at people as diet.
Well, exactly. And that, to me, is the real danger, is that's when polar bears are really dangerous. If in the spring they're not getting enough to eat, they have to eat. And they have, a drive. And when there's ice form all north of Newfoundland the way it is, and they're right offshore there looking for seals, if there's no seals for them to eat, all they have to do is walk on shore.
Oh, yeah. And it strikes me that
they can break down.
Yeah, it strikes me that
they can break down doors, they can break down windows, anything. Nothing's going to keep them out.
So you mean they're brave enough to actually break into a human dwelling?
Oh, absolutely, and they do. And, all across the Arctic. It's one of the reasons why they're dangerous.
Wow.
They're so strong they can smash through doors, they can break windows and crawl in, and it just, it's the implication that people then wouldn't even be safe in their own homes.
Wow.
And my point being is that it's not in summer that they would be dangerous. It would be in spring if they didn't have the food they needed.
And so, in fact, in that case, the endangered species would be Inuit children, not the polar bear. Jeez.
Yeah.
Well,
exactly.
What webpage should people go to learn more about your work, or even to perhaps support your work? If you accept donations, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I write a polar bear, a blog that's called polarbearscience.com that I've been writing since 2012. And yes, I do accept donations. And I also have a writer's page for my books that's called SusanCrockford.com.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly going to order those fictions. Those should be quite fun, and ominous, because fortunately right now, the polar bears are not super hungry overall, so that's a really good thing. So this, as you say, this is a success story. And, it's nice to start the year out with a couple of interviews about things that are not going wrong with the environment. So thanks so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for being on the program today, Susan. And if people want to ask you questions, is there a link or some way they can contact you by email on your website?
On both of my websites, there's a contact me form that people can